Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Thanks for coming back for the Make Eve Real track here at Fanfest 2014. Those of you who were with us last year, remember we began this effort to bring in leading physicists, astronauts, people to be able to tell us about how we might make some of these technologies in EVE Online come to us a little earlier than the 20,000 years in the future that they are currently expected to hit. And we had 3 great speakers last year, and we brought another one to us in EVE Vegas, and that was Les Johnson, one of the foremost authorities on interstellar travel and an award-winning person on his work on solar sails in particular. We had such a great time with Les in Vegas, we knew we needed to bring him back here for you guys in Reykjavik, and he's been able to update his presentation with a lot of new material, which he'll be going through here shortly. Les is a published author. His most recent book, Going Interstellar, and another book, Back to the Moon, are both on sale here, and he'll be able to do some signing for that after the show, after his presentation. Additionally, Les, in addition to being a physicist, is also the deputy manager for the Advanced Concepts Office for NASA in Huntsville, Alabama. And so please join me in giving him a warm welcome, and we'll be delighted to hear from him. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you for the warm welcome. I tend to talk loudly because I'm not used to being mic'd, and this is a pretty big room. So if I blow you out of your seats, I apologize up front. As it was introduced, I do work for NASA, but I am not here representing NASA. Anything I say is my personal opinion, because my interstellar work is actually done in my spare time. And my science fiction writing and all that happens off the clock, so just bear with me on that. First thing I'd like to do is thank Eve for having me come back. I'm going to explain in a minute how I happened to be invited to come to EVE Vegas and now come to this fantastic country to talk to you about how someday we might actually go to the stars. And the winding path took me to Las Vegas last year, where I presented to a much smaller crowd, but equally enthusiastic. And I quite frankly think that was my audition for coming here, because after that talk, they invited me to join you here at the big event at FanFest. And thank you, Eve, and thank you, CCP, for inviting me. I appreciate it, and I'm having a great time. The winding path that got me here, I think, but I'd have to ask the folks at CCP to get their side of the story, is that I published a book where I co-edited with award-winning author Jack McDevitt a collection of short stories by different authors about realistic interstellar travel. You won't find, I'm sorry, you won't find warp drive or wormholes in this book. But it's a book about what are the human elements, what are the challenges about going to the stars that we might actually face someday. And interspersed with these original short stories, I wrote some essays, and some of my co-authors wrote essays that are kind of the facts behind the fiction that explain the technologies that I'll be talking about today and how they might come to be. Well, after that book was published and got pretty good reviews, I was contacted by National Geographic magazine. Turns out their January 2013 issue was all about the future of exploration. And they were interviewing Antarctic explorers, undersea explorers, people who were going to the Amazon basin, and they wanted to talk about what is the next great exploration in space. So after long discussions on the telephone about the article that ended up being the cover story for that issue of National Geographic, I was stunned when they said, well, this is great. We want to feature you as the interstellar explorer. So they sent a photographer to Huntsville, Alabama, and this is the picture that was ultimately used in the issue. And what I'm holding is critical to this discussion. It's a piece of solar sail material, which I believe will ultimately be the technology that allows us to take that first step to the stars. And don't worry, I'll build up to that and explain why. Now, I have to admit, I was honored to be in this issue of National Geographic, but it was also kind of embarrassing, because you can look at this picture and tell the greatest risk that I had for being in the magazine was probably getting a sunburn on my bald head, right? I'm in there with people who have lost toes in the Arctic, people who have had malaria, okay? And the biggest risk I have in my coat and tie is getting a sunburn. But I think it captured some imagination, and I think it partly led to me being here. And again, I thank Eve and CCP for having me come. Now, I am a science fiction fan. I've been a science fiction fan since I was a kid. I am also an unrepentant optimist. All the machinations of the gaming that you play aside, I am an absolute positivist when it comes to what humanity will be capable of. And I think it will be a choice of ours in the future as to whether we go to the stars or not. And I think we're going to lay the groundwork for making that possible, and I hope we make the choice. And Star Trek and science fiction inspired me. It's one of the reasons I work for NASA, and it's also one of the reasons that I've started writing science fiction, is to try to bring on that next generation. I was also inspired by science fact. I was 7 years old when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. I remember watching that grainy image in black and white. Yes, some of you are too young to remember black and white, and also when there were only 3 TV stations. But they all carried this, at least in the US, there were only 3. But they all carried this, and it was just a moment of inspiration, and that's what inspired me. But let's talk about today. Where are we with interstellar travel? Well, it's hard to believe, but before 1992, the only planets that we knew existed were in our own solar system. We had no experimental evidence that there were planets around other stars. Now, if you were a science fiction watcher or reader, you knew that there were, right? If you were a working scientist or astronomer, it was highly likely, based on what we understand about how our own solar system formed, it was highly likely that there were planets out there, but there was no measurable, objective scientific evidence that they existed, okay? Well, in 1992, that evidence came. It came from a very large, energetic object called a pulsar. And how they deduced that there was a planet around this is by looking at variations in the very precise timing of the energy radiation that came from this rapidly rotating, very distant, very energetic object. And they concluded, scientists looked at it, and there was a regular disturbance to its emissions, that the only thing that could be causing this is something very large, think much larger than Jupiter, orbiting it, that was disturbing it somewhat in the way that it emitted its radiation and its pointing. So that was the first measured evidence of there being a planet around another star. Today, we have found thousands of these planets. It seems like you can't look in the news sources on the internet without seeing that we've discovered some new planet orbiting a distant star. What's significant about that is we're also now finding planets that don't just orbit the big, bright, huge stars or the really small, dim stars. We're finding planets that are orbiting stars like our sun. And the recent news of the past week or so has been that we may have found around one of these stars a planet that's Earth-sized that appears to be in that habitable zone where it could allow there to be liquid water, right? So what that means is, hey, this might be interesting. Could there be life there? Well, there may be. There are over 1,000 confirmed exoplanets that are known today. And this is only within a very small region of the galaxy in which we're looking and which we have the instruments sensitive enough to look. And there are hundreds of billions of stars in our galaxy. So if we're finding this many exoplanets in this small region, there should be billions of planets throughout our galaxy that are there for us to explore someday. Very briefly, I'm going to go over a couple of methods that we use to find these extrasolar planets, all right? One of which has been used fairly recently and is pretty well defined, is the fact that just like the sun's mass and its gravity keeps the Earth in orbit around it and tugs on the Earth so that we follow this circular orbit around the sun, so does the Earth pull on the sun. It's a very small tug, but what it does is it causes the sun to wobble ever so slightly, and that affects the light that comes off our sun. And there are stars out there now that we have space-based and ground-based instruments sensitive enough that we can detect the difference in the light emissions caused by this wobble as a planet the size of the Earth or larger orbits it. If it's got a regularly occurring variation in the light emissions, happens all at a certain period, like the Earth's rotational period around the sun, you can conclude that there's a planet orbiting it, how big that planet is, and how far it is from the star. But the biggest way we found, the one that has been the explosion of extrasolar planets, was a telescope called the Kepler. Now, Kepler basically was looking at a region of the sky and all these stars that are out there, and it was staring at them for a long period of time. And to give you an example of what it was looking for, and thankfully we have instruments sensitive enough to detect, imagine going out tonight when the sun finally sets over Reykjavik, right, midnight or thereabouts, and you're looking at the headlight of a car, and you stare at that headlight. Now imagine that a flea or a mosquito flies in front of it. You know that that mosquito is going to cast a shadow, but you're not going to see it with your eyes. They're not sensitive enough. But we have instruments that are sensitive enough to see the dimming of the star, just like the dimming of that headlight happens with a mosquito flying in front of it. And if that happens again regularly along the line of sight between us and that star, it can only mean one thing. There's a planet that is coming into view between us and the star and blocking just a little bit of the light coming from that star. Now, the reason I can't put up here 3,000 to 4,000 confirmed exoplanets is because before an exoplanet can be confirmed as existing, there has to be an independent confirmation of its existence by another team of scientists using different instruments. So what's happening is Kepler is finding them, and other scientists are using other methods to confirm them, and then it goes on the list of confirmed exoplanets. Well, Les, that's great. What about nearby? Turns out that the nearest star system to our own, the Alpha Centauri system, which is actually 3 stars, there is a planet there around Alpha Centauri b. That is the closest known extrasolar planet. It's not one that looks like it could harbor life. If you look at the details up here, it orbits its star every 3 days and is a very, very hot place to be. Now, does that mean we shouldn't go there? Maybe in the future we should go there, but it's not the place where we would want to go look for likely existence of other life like our own. So let's talk about distances and going to the stars. And here's where you're going to see the challenge for making things like Eve real. I think as a player and as someone who is aware of the world and thinking about going to the stars, you may have a sense that the stars are really far away, but I'm going to try to put that in perspective in a way that is semi-measurable to us here today. And those of you who are not from the US will have to forgive me because I think feet and miles. Okay, I don't think meters and kilometers, so try to do a quick correction, and I've done a little bit of that in my slides. But let's reduce the Earth-Sun distance, the distance from us to our parent star, to a distance of 1 foot, roughly the size of my shoe. Now, astronomers might call that an astronomical unit. 1 AU, 93 million miles, okay? Let's reduce that distance. On this scale, the Earth is as far away from the sun as from the heel to my toe. Mars is only another 6 inches away. Have we been to Mars yet with people? No. We send robots there, and they take 9 months to get there. In essence, they take 9 months to go 6 inches, all right? Neptune, poor Pluto, Neptune is the most distant planet in our solar system. It's out about 30 AU, 30 feet. So roughly the early middle section of the seats that are down here, okay? To get to the nearest star on this scale, you would have to go 271,000 astronomical units, which is approximately over 50 miles, okay, on that scale. And that's to the closest star. We don't have anything today that can do that in a reasonable amount of time. And if you look at the map of the stars that are around us, there are lots of places to go just beyond the Alpha Centauri system. This is a 3-dimensional map of nearby interstellar space, and there are many, many stars that are just beyond our reach, as Alpha Centauri system is beyond our reach. So the question always comes up, always, how do we get there? Well, I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you what you don't want to do. The first thing we have to know is that our first interstellar explorers are the Voyager spacecraft. Those were launched in 1977, okay? I was in high school when Voyager was launched. Some of you might be surprised to learn, maybe not, that Voyager is still alive. Every week it sends back its location and information from deep space about what it's seeing out there. And we're tracking it, and you can go to the Voyager website and track it as it's traveling further out of the solar system. But even traveling 17 kilometers per second to get to the nearest star, if it were pointed in that direction, it would take 74,000 years. Its plutonium power source will run out long before then, and it's not pointed at the nearest star, and who knows if anyone's going to find it, but it's on its way out. So rockets clearly are not going to be able to take us to the stars. What can? Well, I'm going to take you on a thought experiment here, and I'm a physicist, all right? So I'm going to tell you the ways that it appears that nature will allow us to go to the stars. Those of you who are engineers, please don't throw things at me, okay? I don't know how to engineer these systems, all right? But there's no fundamental law of physics that says they can't be done. Imagine going back 150 years where the theories of flight were being postulated and people were thinking about maybe someday building this thing that would fly through the air. And someone comes in and says, great, let's go from no flight to building an Airbus. Okay, the engineers of the time would just say, I have no idea what you're even talking about, right? But the physicists might say, well, yeah, I consider you could get a big plane to fly, maybe. Okay, so there's a difference between the knowledge that it can be done and actually how you do it. Well, I was approached after the publication of Going Interstellar by Nat Geo, a TV channel, cable channel, and they were doing a program where the Earth was going to be destroyed in 75 years. It was called Evacuate Earth. And they said, Les, if we have 75 years before this big magnetar comes into the solar system and knocks Earth out of its orbit and kills all life on Earth, how do we get people off? And I said, what you do is Project Orion. All right, any hands? Anybody heard of Project Orion? Oh, good, good. I don't have to do a lot of explanation. It is a crazy idea, but there's no practical reason that it wouldn't work if you don't mind destroying the Earth's ecosystem in the process, right? Imagine taking a ship, a cruise ship, a battleship, put it on its side, seal it up for space, put all your people in it, all the food and supplies for a multi-hundred-year voyage, build big steel plates the size of this auditorium to put under it with big shock absorbers. And the comparison I'd give for these shock absorbers is what's under the Tokyo Edo Museum, which is also, like Iceland, in an earthquake-prone area, but they want their museum to survive the big one when it hits Tokyo. So you can look through the floor, and they have these enormous shock absorbers which are holding up the entire museum. That's of the scale that would have to be between the plate and the battleship that would be above us, or the aircraft carrier, or the cruise ship. Now, every 3 seconds, explode a hydrogen bomb under that plate. Boom, boom, boom. Eventually, you would lift your craft into space and accelerate to a few percent the speed of light and be on your way to going to another star with a trip time of a few hundred years. Now, the people back home would be pretty angry at you, okay? You would make a mess of things back here, so I would never advocate us doing this, but there's no real physical reason we can't do this if we had to do it, and that was what was explored in this Nat Geo special. Another way that might be able to do this is through nuclear fusion. Now, fusion is the way that our sun provides energy to us today, and the sun does it by brute force. All right? The sun basically is a big ball of hydrogen, and all of the mass of the sun is squeezing the hydrogen together at its core, and it squeezes it so tight, and those atoms are compressed so tightly that they form helium and give off energy in the process called fusion. Now, don't confuse this with how we get power from a nuclear power plant, because that's in fissioning or breaking an atom. Even fission in a spacecraft would not give you the energy to have a reasonable trip time to the nearest star. So we have to throw out conventional nuclear power completely. We need to be thinking about things like fusion. Now, there are researchers around the world today who are working on making fusion happen in a way that it is past what's called break-even. Right now, fusion happens. We can simulate what the sun does at its core on the Earth by combining hydrogen atoms together under intense pressure to form helium and emit energy. But right now, we put a lot more energy in than we get out. We haven't broken even on the energy balance. Until recently, within the last year, the first experiments of break-even have occurred. We have a long way to go to where we get more energy out, like the sun does, than goes into it. But once we do that, we could use that on Earth for fairly clean nuclear power here on the ground that doesn't have a lot of the risks of weaponization and other things like fission reactors do, and they certainly don't have the waste. But I'm more far visionary than that. I want to miniaturize it further still and use it to power our spacecraft, to provide the energy for our space drive. There are people who are looking at this and are already designing that craft. There was a group back in the 1970s in Project Daedalus, sponsored by the British Interplanetary Society, of which I'm very happy to be a member. And the British Interplanetary Society said, let's postulate that we can do fusion on board the craft. Design the rest of the craft. How much do you need to carry the people? How much food? What kind of resupply do you need? What kind of recycling systems? How much propellant do you need? Design all the other systems that go around the drive so that when those bright people in the nuclear research laboratories get us the fusion drive, we'll have an idea of what the spacecraft has to look like. To give a sense of scale, the bottom picture here shows how big Daedalus would be compared to the Saturn V rocket, which took people to the moon in the 1960s. It's huge. And if there's no other message that I want to get across to you today, and that is that to go to the stars, you've got to think big. Big size, big ambition, big projects, all right? The numbers are here. If you like numbers, I know there are people in Eve who like numbers. These are some of the numbers for traveling to the stars on a fusion-driven spaceship. The key number that I'll mention here is 50 years travel to Barnard's star, which is in that chart I showed earlier, that is beyond the nearest star, but a reachable distance for humanity. So a fusion-driven starship, if we can get fusion to work on a small scale, we could build a spacecraft and use it to go to the stars. One of the best ways to convert matter to energy in a rocket, and I've still been talking about rockets, not chemical rockets. Fusion is, Project Orion is a nuclear rocket. Fusion-driven starships are nuclear rockets. Antimatter propulsion is also a nuclear rocket, but it uses the most energy-efficient way to convert matter to energy that we think exists. Einstein made it famous with E equals mc squared, and basically what it means is you take a particle of matter and antimatter and bring them together, and they annihilate, producing gamma rays, all sorts of secondary particles, and giving off lots of energy. It's the perfect battery. Also, the perfect bomb, if it all goes off at one time. Now, Star Trek used antimatter to power their warp drive. I would like to use antimatter to take us to the stars. I have to digress, and I think I have time to digress for a minute. Back at Marshall, 15 years ago, the Marshall Space Flight Center where I work, there was a group of engineers, of which I was not involved, who wanted to build the world's first very small antimatter thruster. Okay? So they actually designed with various universities, University of Pennsylvania, a trap that would allow them to go up to the Fermilab National Accelerator Laboratory in the US. Today we'd want to go to CERN, where they routinely collide atoms head-on and see what comes out. Well, when they do these collisions of protons colliding very, very fast, near the speed of light, and they observe what comes out, and this is how they discovered the Higgs boson that made the news, inevitably, some of the particles that come out are antimatter. Electrons that instead of having a negative charge have the same mass of an electron, but they have a positive charge, a positron. And there will be protons that come out of some of these interactions, and it'll be something that'll have the same mass and characteristics of a proton, but it'll have, instead of a positive charge, a negative charge. There's a spin state that's different in there too. It's not just the charge, but that's what's most obviously noticed. These are real, but they don't last long, because inevitably the antiproton hits a proton, annihilates, produces energy, it's gone. So you have to have a vacuum that's as close to a perfect vacuum as we can get, and you have to have a way to trap that proton so it doesn't touch the sides of the bottle that's holding it. Well, you can do that with very strong magnetic fields, the same effect that allows you to view the aurora here at northern latitudes. Charged particles spiral along magnetic field lines. They're trapped there. So a big, strong magnetic field in a vacuum bottle should be able to trap this antimatter. So these NASA engineers designed this experiment. They wanted to get permission to bring antimatter back to Alabama from Illinois. Just like good engineers would do, they went to the department in the government, the US government, that regulates interstate travel of radioactive materials, things like radiation materials used for dental x-rays or used in medical research, gives off radiation. And they designed this trap so that if it totally failed, the amount of radiation that would be given off would be roughly equivalent to that of a chest x-ray that you might get if you go to the hospital. Not much, because it would not be many antimatter particles that would be trapped. So they go to the government, the other part of the government that's not NASA, and say, look, we want to make sure we have all ducks in a row and transport this antimatter. They're thinking that they're going to be laughed at because this is obviously a ridiculous idea. But wouldn't you know it, someone pulls a manual off the shelf and they already have an existing regulation for transporting antimatter across state lines. So that was a surprise. So they knew what they had to build this to. We still don't know where that regulation came from, although if you think Cold War 1950s, you might have an idea as to why someone would be thinking that way. But unfortunately, the funding was canceled and this experiment didn't take place, and that very small puff of the world's first antimatter thruster didn't happen. But it will happen. Someone somewhere will do this and show that it's possible. This is what an antimatter engine might look like. The scale of the ship that it develops is of the same scale as Project Daedalus, because you still need all those supplies for people. But the amount of antimatter you need is staggering. Today, the global production of antimatter, if we could collect it all and store it, would be roughly a nanogram. The amount that we need to go to the stars is in thousands of kilograms. We're clearly not going to produce this today, and probably not on planet Earth. We will have to design new processes for the production and storage of antimatter, and given how dangerous this will be on the ground, let's hope that's at the moon or further away when we do that. But there's no law of physics that says we can't do it. It's just really, really hard, really difficult. So now we get to my favorite. This is an area of research that I actively do in my job at NASA, and I have written about. I've got a book out there. It's a popular science book that my co-authors and I wrote, all about solar sails. And solar sails will take us to the stars robotically before we start thinking about sending people. Briefly, these lights that are blinding me here so I can barely see you are pushing on me. As the light reflects from me and goes into your eyes, there is a small momentum transfer that's happening. Just think of the particles of light as bouncing off of me, like when you're playing a game of pool and the pool balls hit each other. And you conserve momentum as one bumps into the other and knocks it away. Well, this light is pushing on me, but it's a very small push. The push that we experience here is far overwhelmed by the acceleration of Earth's gravity, and probably the airflow from the heating and cooling system in this room puts more forces on you than the light that's up here, okay? But if you go out in space and have sunlight, and you don't have the Earth's gravity, and you don't have atmosphere, and you unfurl a large reflector, think of a solar sailing ship of yesterday, but made out of an aluminum or an aluminum-coated material, and you start reflecting light from it, it will move. This has been demonstrated. It's an effect that happens to spacecraft in Earth orbit, but we've never really, in the US yet, built a ship that takes advantage of this. Others have, and we are about to cross that threshold. Solar sailing is real. Now, I want to point out, as this chart might show you, and I don't want your eyes to glaze over, but if you've had freshman physics in college or in high school, you might remember doing those force diagrams where you have to have forces and inclined planes and where's the net force and all that good stuff. But what it means is that as the light reflects from the sail, it's going to push it radially outward if the point source of light, like the sun, is here in the audience. But if I tilt this sail, the light reflects off at an angle, which means the net thrust is in another direction. If I tilt it this way, it reflects so that it's anti-parallel to that direction. And what that means is I can use the sail to accelerate this way or go this way. Once I'm in space and in orbit, I can then use the sail to spiral in toward the sun, or to spiral out from the sun, or tipped and tilted this way, and I can go into orbit around the sun's poles, all without fuel. It's a mechanical structure. NASA flew a small solar sail in Earth orbit. It was called NanoSail D. It flew in 2010. It was deployed from a 3U CubeSat. A CubeSat is the size of a loaf of bread, all right? This sail had an area of 10 square meters. There was also communications, power, all sorts of instrumentation to talk about how it worked. It was a successful test flight and test deployment in Earth orbit. The Japanese flew Icarus in 2010. They jumped to the first generation interplanetary solar sail. This sail is 14 meters on a side. It's a square sail, 14 meters on a side, that was launched and is still flying in the inner solar system near Venus. They are the first to demonstrate interplanetary solar sailing, and Japan is planning a mission to the outer planets that will use a larger version of this sail as its propulsion system. This GIF, this animated GIF, if it'll play, was actually taken from Icarus in deep space. The Japanese, what they did was so cool. They took essentially a cell phone camera, put it in a little sub-satellite, and out there flying near Venus, they kicked it off the main spacecraft and said, take a selfie. This is the first really deep space selfie. It's a series of deep space selfies taken of Icarus, and there it is. These are actual pictures from the inner solar system taken from a small satellite with a very small transmitter that transmitted the data back to the parent satellite, which then relayed it back to Earth, so the engineers back home could see that the sail deployed and was working properly. Okay? The next one I want to talk about is what's happening in the near future in the United States and in Europe. NASA has planned a mission called Sunjammer for 2015, which will be a very large solar sail, 38 meters on a side, deployed from a box smaller than a standard podium, okay, 38 meters on a side, 1,200 square meters, that's going to navigate in the inner solar system and serve as a precursor for very ambitious deep space missions. And there are missions that we're studying, one of which I'm the principal investigator for, if it's approved for flight, that would use an 80 square meter solar sail deployed from a 6U CubeSat, think 2 loaves of bread, 80 meters, 80 square meters, 9 by 9. We're already developing the sail that will go visit a near-Earth asteroid. And if it succeeds and keeps functioning, because there's no propellant, we'll fly from that near-Earth asteroid to the next one and keep going as long as the spacecraft is functioning. What's the near-term stepping stone? I'm going to shift gears. I've talked about how we go to the stars and what we might want to do, and now I'm going to talk about a real mission that's being discussed, and that is a solar sail large enough to pass Voyager, okay, even though it was launched in 1977, and travel out of the solar system into nearby interstellar space. It would be called Interstellar Probe. Interstellar Probe, the solar sail mission I'm talking about, and Sunjammer are on this roadmap that will eventually take us to the stars. Now, Les, how big a step do we have to go from these initial solar sails to one that might take us to the stars? Well, remember, I've told you to think big, okay? So to build a solar sail flying very close to the sun, think inside the orbit of Mercury, that could have a trip time of 1,000 years or less, it would be roughly the size of the US state of Texas. 1/10 the diameter of a hair, and as large as the state of Texas. Do we know how to engineer this? No. Is it physically possible? I've talked to material scientists. We've looked at the fundamental wavelength interactions with coatings that might be reflective at that small a scale. They are all possible, but we don't know how to build something this big, let alone launch it into space. Is there a reason we can't do it someday? No. We just have to get busy and make the stepping stone progress to get there. Now, if you really want to go to the stars faster with a robotic probe, you think even bigger. You might even reduce the size of your sail, but instead of using only sunlight to propel it, because remember, the sun gets dim as you move away from it, so the further you get away from the sun, the less push you have on your solar sail. Well, if you put a very large laser using the sun to power it, and focus the laser on the sail, and have a series of lenses in the solar system to keep the laser focused on your sail, you could potentially reduce that trip time to another star to less than 100 years, perhaps a quarter of a century, with very, very powerful lasers. The laser power would be in the terawatts, okay? Now that power is roughly comparable to the complete energy output of humanity on planet Earth today. Is this something we can do now? No, absolutely not. We can do this in the future, though. The energy use curve, the energy production curve, and as we get better at space solar power, this may be possible someday. And if I had to place a bet on what technology would take us to the stars first, I would place my bet on beamed energy sails. Now, there is one sense that the Eve universe is like ours, and a lot of senses where it isn't. You haven't heard me talking about wormholes. You haven't heard me talking about warp drive. Within the known laws of physics, it doesn't look like these are really possible. People talk about theoretically that if you had a planet the size of Jupiter made out of negative matter, whatever negative matter is, and you can convert that to energy, then you might be able to open up a wormhole somewhere and travel through it to some distant point. There are people that are postulating the amount of energy that would be required to potentially build these warp drive thrusters. That's all speculative physics. It's neat to think about, but unless we have some dramatic breakthrough in our understanding of the laws of nature, that will remain in science fiction. And I hope that we don't understand nature and that loophole is out there, because I think it would be fantastic if we found a way to make it happen on scales that are shorter than what I've described up to this point. But that Eve universe possibilities are very much like ours, and that the Eve universe is unbounded opportunity. Well, I believe our universe is too, and it's going to be ours to do and to take. What are those steps that we can do? Well, I've described things that are happening to enable the propulsion, but obviously we aren't going to be able to undertake a voyage like this unless we are masters of our own solar system. The antimatter production facilities will probably be created on the moon or further out using fusion power to drive the accelerators that produce all the antimatter. The solar sails that are the size of a US state aren't going to be manufactured on the ground and launched into space. They're going to be woven in space with telerobotics and small spacecraft that weave these together in deep space so they never have to experience the force of Earth's gravity, so that you can build the solar sail. There are steps that can happen in the near term to make that happen. And in the interviews I've given here at EVE, and in talking to people since EVE Vegas and since writing the book, the question always comes up, Les, this is so far out. How are we ever going to get there? How are you going to get people's interest in space exploration to the point where we're going to even think about doing this? Well, my answer, it turns out, is to look back to planet Earth. I believe space technology in the intermediate term and in the near term, if you define near term as being 25 years out, can do things to help improve the quality of life for everyone on the planet and get us out of this potential ecological disaster that we may be facing as we rapidly use up our Earth-based resources and we allow and encourage the other billions of people on the planet who don't have the resources to come to Iceland and don't have the resources to play EVE, but even more importantly, don't have the resources to feed their children and give them an education. How do we elevate them out? What we do this with is cheap energy, abundant energy, and we do it in a way that doesn't destroy the planet in the process. The technologies are coming together, I believe, that within the next 25 years could enable something like power from space solar power to become a reality. Solar photovoltaics are becoming less expensive. Commercial launch to take tourists into space and the rapid increase in the launch rate around the planet is going to drive down launch costs. Research into solar power systems on Earth has made them lighter weight and more robust. I think we're coming close to having the technologies we need to put a network of satellites in space to beam clean energy down to the planet that has minimum, I won't say zero, minimum impact on the environment, and we can shut down these nuclear power stations and coal power stations for good and use the energy of the sun to power our civilization, not just for us, but for everyone on the planet. I think we can go to the moon. I'm glad there's a receptive audience. You've studied this, you know this. We can go to the moon and we can mine helium-3. Turns out the fusion reaction, which is so hard to do here on the Earth, is much easier if you don't do the brute force approach of taking all these hydrogen atoms and try to squeeze them together. You can actually creatively mix in a certain type of helium into the process and make the fusion reaction go faster and more efficiently to enable fusion power plants. It takes an isotope of helium, which is rare on Earth, but has been deposited in the surface of the moon over time by the solar wind. It's come into the Earth's atmosphere too, but a lot of it's leaked away into space and it's not readily accessible, but it's on the surface of the moon. So if I have to have the choice of strip mining the mountains of West Virginia or mountains anywhere on the planet Earth to get coal for a power plant versus strip mining a few square kilometers on the moon to get the helium-3 for a power plant, where there is no life, I know where I'm going to go, all right? I come from East Kentucky originally. Strip mining is devastating to the environment, so we can have power. This we can do and not affect any ecosystem and potentially provide power on Earth. That's another step we need to be taking. And the climate change problem. This may get a little controversial. I'm a big thinker, I'm a big dreamer, so forgive me, but I'm going to tell you right now that to elevate the standard of living of everybody on the planet may require that those of us in the developed world reduce hours or live with lower energy use. But there's no way we're going to recycle ourselves into prosperity for 5 other billion people. And so as the impoverished parts of the planet see the success of what's happening in China, which is quickly catching up with Japan, South Korea, Europe, and the United States and Canada and other parts of the world to elevate to first world status, they're going to start consuming the planet's resources just like we do, and in the near term that's going to produce more carbon gas emissions and exaggerate the greenhouse gas problem. With solar sails, we could launch a flotilla of these, maybe a few thousand of them, if not more, to block just a little bit of the sunlight from our own sun, to decrease the energy input into the planet so that we offset the effects of rising temperatures until we get our house in order with space solar power and fusion power and get that energy curve to the carbon dioxide emissions to start coming down so that we can keep this planet habitable. And I will argue that out of all the mega engineering projects that people have proposed to counteract the rise in global temperature from carbon dioxide emissions, this is one worth trying, because if we screw it up and there's some unforeseen effect on the ecology of the planet by blocking just a little bit of light that none of us would notice, we just have the sails fly away and it will be as if they were never there to begin with. Now, can we do this today? No. Can we do this in 25 years? No. But if we're building space solar power and we're building those fusion plants, this is the next logical step. This is something we could do in 50 to 75 years when the climate crisis could be reaching a real tipping point for the planet. My contention is it needs to be in the discussion space. There may be a fundamental flaw and it may not work, but hey, it needs to be considered. The other thing I want to mention is for resources to enable interstellar travel and to save the planet, we've got to stop mining the planet for everything we do. There are companies now looking at mining asteroids. You're EVE players. You know about mining asteroids, right? Okay? There are people that are looking at doing this, for-profit companies that see the benefit of going out there and finding platinum, rare earth elements, and potentially getting them cheaper than they are on Earth, or where the projected cost is going from the rapid industrialization of the third world. They want their cell phones, they want their cars, they want their batteries, they want their technology, they want to elevate themselves out of poverty, they want what we have. And I don't think we should deny it to them. And we can do it without destroying the planet by using these resources. There are companies, Planetary Resources, Deep Space Industries, and others that are looking at mining asteroids and are building the reconnaissance spacecraft to go look at them and do the first assays for figuring out what's out there and how do we get it back to the planet. And I will contend that with the accelerated launch of people like Elon Musk and SpaceX and commercial launch, it's going to make not only tourism more affordable, it's going to make launch more affordable, and this will be possible within the next half century. There are other reasons we might want to move an asteroid. Okay, we heard what happened about a year ago in Chelyabinsk and the whole issue of those hitting the atmosphere. These things happen about once every 100 years. I'm talking about protecting humanity long enough to go to the stars. I would be remiss if I didn't think that as we move asteroids to mine them, we might have other reasons to move them as well, perhaps preventing a global catastrophe. What can you do? You can get involved. There are different groups out there that are advocating for our interstellar future. I'm the chairman of a group called the Tennessee Valley Interstellar Workshop. I'm from Huntsville, Alabama, which is at one end of the Tennessee Valley in the United States. It's where von Braun and the rocket team came after World War II and built the Saturn rockets that took us to the moon. My colleagues built the space shuttle main engines and solid rocket motors. Now they're building solar sails and the Space Launch System, the US's next heavy lift launch vehicle to go to space. At another end of the Oak Ridge, of the Tennessee Valley, is the city of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where the fuel is made for nuclear reactors and for nuclear power, and the brain trust for all things nuclear, excluding places like Los Alamos, but a big chunk of the brain trust in the United States for nuclear power is in Oak Ridge. We have gotten together, and this group has formed a nonprofit organization. We have our third meeting this fall. We are looking at the steps we can take now and in the future, the challenges of going to the stars. There are other groups. Icarus Interstellar, Rich Abusi, I believe, spoke here last year about interstellar travel. There's the 100-Year Starship group. There is Tau Zero Foundation, several groups that are doing this that have their goals and their sights set on the far term of making us an interstellar species. But in the near term, what are the steps we can do today that will help make that happen? You can get involved with some of these groups. They're all out there on the internet. I would encourage you to search them out and find out more about them. So, to conclude, the galaxy we now know is full of planets. It's not just science fiction. They're out there. We're finding them in the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold. Could be a place to support life, either independent of human life or a future home for human life. Reaching the stars is allowed by physics. There's no fundamental law of physics that says, I'm sorry, humans, you're stuck. But what physics has said is, you know, humans, if you want this, you're going to have to work for it. It's going to be hard. It's going to be a big challenge. But as I think about it, and I think about how we can undertake that challenge, as I said previously, we'll have to be masters of our solar system. Why do we want to be masters of our solar system? I contend it's to save our planet. It's why we want to be masters of our solar system. We want to use what's out there for power and resources and let the Earth be a place for life and to live. Okay? Let's take this stuff out there that damages our ecosystem where there is no ecosystem, and let's preserve it here. The question I have for you, and wherever I give this talk, or a variation of this talk, is are we up to that challenge? It's not inevitable. It is not written into our genetic code, you will develop to the point where you go to the stars. It's a choice we're going to make, or not. It's up to us and our descendants. So in my shameless plug, at the conclusion here, I will be out in the bookstore after this talk signing copies of a couple of my books. The one that I think you might be most interested in is the Going Interstellar collection that I spoke of earlier. And I have to mention the other two that are on the page here. One is a nonfiction book which just came out in second edition on April 30th. It's called Harvesting Space for a Greener Earth. That's where my co-authors and I lay out the vision of these next steps we can take to help protect the planet by using space technology. Unfortunately, that book is not here for sale, but it is widely available on Amazon. My publisher is Springer Books, Springer Verlag internationally, I believe. So it's out there and available. And the one on the bottom right to you is my next science fiction novel called Rescue Mode, which I co-wrote with the New York Times bestselling author Ben Bova about what a near-term, realistic mission to Mars might be like. But of course, it's fiction and an adventure story, so something goes wrong, okay? But as a guy who's a propulsion advocate, I will tell you right now, it's not the propulsion system, okay? So with that, I'll wrap up. I'll be glad to take any questions you have out at the signing table. Thank you, you've been great, and enjoy what's left, and I'm looking forward to chatting with as many of you as I can when we party at the top of the world tonight. Thank you very much.